This conference will now be recorded.
All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully we'll have some stragglers that log in eventually. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for listening in on this webinar about you in the Wood River Valley. My name is Stephanie Carlson, and I am the Administrative Services Manager at Blaine County, and I also assist with their outreach and education. As many of you may know, which is probably why you're on this webinar, this past winter, several animals did die from consuming the yew plant in our area. When that did happen earlier after we got a bunch of snow, Blaine County and the Idaho Department of Fish and Game worked together to try to identify the plants that cause these issues and figure out what we could do to educate our community and help protect the wildlife in our area. After this happened, we did receive a lot of questions from the public and did realize that a lot of people wanted to know more about how they could be involved and how they could identify you in their yards. So to help educate our community, we put together this town hall. Our panelists today are Terry Thompson. He's the Regional Communications Manager with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game in Magic Valley. We also have Lynn Kinter, the lead botanist with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and Kay Draper, the Noxious Weeds Department of Blaine County. I ask that throughout this webinar that you mute your computers and post any questions you have in the chat. We also have information in the chat on how you can change your view so you can see the panelists a little bit better. And then at the end of the panelist presentation, I'll go through and present your questions to the panelists to be answered. All right, so now let's go ahead and get started. Terry, if you want to take it over.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. And first off, I'd just like to thank Stephanie for the work she's done to pull this webinar off tonight. So thank you for doing that. Thank you to Blaine County. It's been a interesting reason to bring everybody working together, but I think we've worked well as a team on this issue. So I just wanted to start out tonight by talking about yew on the landscape and how it impacts wildlife. This is not a problem or an issue related specifically to the Wood River Valley. We have had wildlife impacted by yew across southern Idaho over many years, and more locally, 2012, I believe, was the first year that we started to see impacts or animals dying from eating the toxic yew. That was a elk. I think there was two. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lynn, on that one. And then probably the most dramatic impact of yew on wildlife in the Wood River Valley was during the winter of 2015-16, when in a couple different situations we had about 22 elk die that year, and that was kind of the impetus that started the Blaine County commissioners to take up the issue and look at starting an ordinance, which is going to be addressed later. So fast forwarding to this last winter, it's not uncommon for us here, and I should preface, so I'm the Regional Communications Manager at the Magic Valley region. Our office is down here in Jerome. And so starting in January, early to mid-January, we started to get phone calls saying, I've got a dead elk in my yard, or we actually had somebody say, I was looking out my window, I had an elk standing in my yard 1 minute, I turned away, I looked back, the elk is now laying over dead in the driveway. So when those kind of things happen, we contact our local conservation officers up in the Wood River Valley. We've got an officer that has the Ketchum area, Cary area, and then Shoshone. And then we actually pulled officers in from other areas because there was one day when we got a report of 6 dead elk in one small, very small area north of Ketchum. So the first reports came in mid-valley, halfway between Ketchum and Haley. Then all of a sudden we got a report in Haley. Then we get a report in Sun Valley, then in Ketchum. So there was obviously something going on. Many times when we get a call of a dead animal, by the time we're able to respond, it's typically just picking up a carcass, taking it to the dump. But what was happening here was these were very fresh animals. And so our officers would do what we call a field necropsy. It's basically equivalent to an autopsy on a human. We open the animal up and try to see if there's some kind of obvious reason why this animal had just died. When we would open up the stomach of the rumen, we would find it full of U needles. Knowing that U is toxic and the situation with killing wildlife throughout southern Idaho over the years, it made us start to take that step back and say, okay, we've got animals dying from U. The U needles would be found in the mouth, in the esophagus, and like I say, in the rumen. And but the interesting part, the thing that really had us perplexed, was we would look around as best we could, because many of these elk were dying in residential areas, and we just cannot go onto a person's property without their permission. So we would do some cursory looking around houses from what we could see in public spaces, and we weren't finding U, but we knew that the animals were finding U because their rumen were full. So this is when we, as an agency, made sure that county commissioners were aware, which then triggered the involvement of Stephanie and Kay to come in. And so that's when this starting to work as a team kind of started, was when we recognized that animals were dying. We recognized what was causing it. We just couldn't find the plants. So the one thing that I think everybody's probably well aware of, if an elk, moose, deer, a dog, a person is to ingest U, and it gets into the stomach or the rumen, and the acids start to break that down, or just by the chewing action, you're releasing these toxins. So it's fast. These animals were dying. What we found was very close to the plants. So at this point, we know we've had at least 15 animals that have died. All of those are elk except for one moose. Could there be more? Absolutely. After a while, we quit kind of counting. And I don't want to make that sound that we just didn't care, but a body count was not effective or efficient in trying to figure out this problem. So I can't give folks on tonight a definitive number of how many have died, but one is too many. So it's been a pretty serious year on the animals. And but I think we've made major strides forward, and Lynn is going to talk a little bit more about that, as will Kay, because we've now got a plan of attack, if you will, going forward. And I just want to thank the communities, the county, because everybody stepped up once we knew that there was a problem. I would like to just take just a second, because there is a group in the Valley, it's a coalition, if you will, of cities and counties and nonprofits and businesses that meet regularly. It's called the Wood River Valley Wildlife Smart Communities Coalition. And the coalition put together a website this last year. That web address is wrvwildlifesmart.org. On that website, you can find all sorts of tips of how to reduce human-wildlife conflict. This is what I would call, it's not your typical human-wildlife conflict, food condition bears or mountain lions in your yard, but this is definitely a an issue that is caused by people planting ornamental yews in their yard. So if you want to know more about ornamental yews or toxicity or feeding wildlife or how to keep you, your pets safe and wildlife wild, I encourage everybody to take a look at that website. So with that, I'm going to kick it on over to Lynn Kinter, who is also with Fish and Game, and she's our staff botanist.
Thank you, Terry. I appreciated that summary. Well, as Terry explained, when wildlife are near town in the winter and our forage is snow covered, they sometimes browse on toxic yew that's been planted in residential and commercial landscapes. And there's several types of ornamental yews that are commonly planted. I'll talk to you, give you some slides here in a minute or two about that. But these are hardy evergreen shrubs or small trees that are easy to maintain. We can see why they're so popular, but at the same time, they have a long history of being known as some of the world's most poisonous plants. For example, Julius Caesar wrote in 55 BC about the toxic nature of yew. And Shakespeare, in 3 of his plays, mentioned yew. He talked about, the most famous one is probably a line from Macbeth about double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, where the witches are throwing things into this cauldron. And one of the things they throw into the cauldron is yew. So it was well known as being a toxic plant, even in Shakespeare's day. There are many medical and veterinary accounts, fatal effects on people, livestock, pets, and wildlife. And we had over 100 animals lost across southern Idaho in the winter of 1617. That's when it came to my attention. I guess I'll start into the types of yew now and show you a few slides, give you some tips for identifying yew in case you have it in your yard or see it around town. Can you see the screen there? I'm going to presume you can then.
Yes.
So I don't hear otherwise. Thank you. Give you a few tips on identifying yew, which you can see here. Some yew are small and compact. The yew in their native ranges of Europe or Japan, Europe and Asia are the main sources of the ornamental yews that we plant. Although there are Canadian yews, there's 4 main species that have been brought to the US, and some are used as species and some are hybridized, but all are poisonous. Any ornamental yew is poisonous, whether it's English yew, Japanese yew. The Japanese yew is shown on the left here and the English yew on the right. There also is a Chinese yew and Canadian yew that are sometimes sold, but the Japanese yew and its hybrid are the most common in southern Idaho. Now, when you see types of yew for sale at a nursery, they often won't give those species names, but as I said, they're all poisonous no matter what name is on it. Some of the horticultural names include spreading yew, upright yew, Irish yew or Hicks yew, and so on. There are probably 50 or more varieties, and they're in all different shapes and sizes. Some are very small, some are quite large. And then there is a native yew that doesn't grow in the Wood River Valley. It's native to central Idaho, say Washington and Adams County, and on north into Idaho and northwest of there. And it's not used in landscaping because it has a high water use. It typically grows at the river's edge. These are small trees or shrubs up to 60 feet tall. And they're kind of lanky trees. They have very low levels of the toxin. And in fact, they're an important wildlife forage. Moose, deer, and elk can eat them. So the tiny amounts of the toxin, the trace amounts of this toxic chemical won't bother them, but the ornamental yews have so much more of the toxic chemical that the wildlife just can't use them. To give you an idea of the kind of diversity of the ornamental yews, some are very wispy, wavy, open shrubs or small trees. Some are much more compact, like the ones on the left here, especially if they've been pruned into into a more compact shape, but there are also just varieties that are going to stay smaller throughout their life, regardless of how they're pruned. The one on the right is not pruned much at all, but a little bit, and it gives you an idea that some yew can be more columnar. Here are two others. One's quite large, the one on the right kind of looming over the house there. So the tree form isn't planted as much in southern Idaho, but I have seen it occasionally. And then sometimes it can be really hard to recognize, especially if it's hidden under snow. This was in Sun Valley a few weeks, probably about a month ago now. And I'm sure the landowner didn't recognize at first what this was, because it's just a few sprigs sticking out from the snow. It's one of the more open forms. And some are very low growing. So again, here, there's just a little bit sticking out from under the snow. In order to ID the yew and tell it from some of the lookalikes, some of the other conifers or evergreens, shrubs that you might find in the Wood River Valley, you have to look at the needles. Yew has flat needles that are about 1 inch long, and they're abruptly pointed on the tip. That abrupt point is termed a cusp. And you can see on the yew on the right, the needle here comes to us, it's kind of a little swooped in on the sides. It's not a straight point, and that's distinctive. When you see this flat needle, flattened cross section, and then this abrupt point or cusp, you've got a yew. The needles are also arranged mostly in a flat plane. Sometimes they'll be more flat than this, or sometimes they'll be spiraled around the stem. And you'll notice that the tops of the needles are dark green, while the bottom side is light green. You may see a red berry-like fruit on the yew. This is termed an aurel. It has an opening in the end, and you can see the seed in the middle there. This isn't always present. It's present on female plants, and yew is one of the types of plants that have male plants and female plants. Many species, different species have male and female on the same plant, but in the case of yew, they have distinctly female plants or male plants only. And so these fruits are produced in the late summer and fall. You're likely to see these, and these can be really attractive to kids. Apparently they taste a little bit sweet. And so if a child eats the fruit itself isn't poisonous, but the seed in the middle is very poisonous. And in fact, as little as 3 seeds can be enough to kill a child. So it's really important if you have kids in your household. The most poisoning cases are kids around 2 or 3 years old, that they understand they cannot eat these things. They cannot eat these fruits. So as inviting as they may look, the fruits persist into the winter. They'll be dried, the dried aurel here you can see. And then by early spring, you start to see the aurel for the coming year starting to form. And so they look kind of like miniature acorns. The fruits are a little bit bigger than a pea, to give you a size or scale there. On the male plants, you won't see fruits, but at the right time of year, it'd be winter and spring, you'll see the male pollen cones forming. So that's what's going to open up and produce the pollen. Some shrubs have no fruits, either the male pollen cones or the aurels on them, especially if they've been pruned off or they've fallen off, or if it's just a hybrid that doesn't happen to produce it, you may not see either one. So keep in mind the needles, these flat needles about 1 inch long, they're kind of softly flexible, and this cusp or abrupt point on the end. Now I'll show you a few lookalikes and how you can tell them apart. The one I confuse it with from a distance most commonly is called dwarf Alberta spruce, and this is it on the left here. It's about the same size as some of the yew shrubs. There are also blue spruce that are pruned into and put on a standard. You can see the little trunk here, the short little trunk. It looks pretty different than the tall blue spruce trees, but whatever kind of spruce it is, it's going to have square needles. They're square in cross section and not flat like yew needles. And they also have a stiff, straight point on the end. They're not that abrupt cusp like you saw on the yew needles. Another look-alike that you might see is a fir. And I'm showing a pretty big fir here on the left, but some can be more what we might think of as typical yew size, especially if someone's had a fir for a Christmas tree. They got a living Christmas tree and planted it outside. That would be a common size, you know, of a fir, at least when they're first being planted in someone's yard. And you can tell firs because their needles are all rounded on the tip. They have almost blunt tips on them, in fact. And they kind of sweep up from the bottom, the needles do. So that when you look at the bottom, you don't really see needles at all. You just see all these, or you don't really see the tips of the needles. You see the needles curving up towards the top. And then when you look at the top, you just see all the tips of the needles sticking up like this. So look for those flat tipped or very round tipped needles. In botany, talk about a flat friendly fir and a sharp square spruce to keep the difference in help us remember the difference in the two. Another look-alike is mugo pine. From a distance, these are often pruned in the same shape that a yew hedge might be. But when you get up close, you'll see these needles. They're much longer. It's hard to tell a scale here, but they're more like 2 inches long, and some pines have needles up to 6 inches long, you know, other species of pines. They're grouped in little bundles along the stem. Instead of just seeing one needle like on a yew, you'll see little bundles of needles. Depending on the species, there might be 2, 3, or 5 needles in a bundle. And they're pointed a bit on the end, but they're not flat in cross section. They're more kind of angled, and they're not cuspidate, or they don't have that abrupt point on the end. Bristlecone pine might also look like yew from a distance, but again, when you get up close, you'll see the needles that are distinctively different. And if you see any kind of a woody cone, like a pine cone or a spruce cone, then you'll know it's not a yew as well, because you never have woody cones. They only have the little yellow male cones or the red fruit. Another look-alike is a juniper. And they can be pruned into many different shapes, similar to the way that yew is pruned. Here's 3 different shapes of juniper. They all have scale-like leaves or very short, stiff needles, a 1/2 inch long or less. They really hurt when you try to shake hands with them. So if you see these sharp needles, especially on young branches, or you may see these overlapping scales, then you'll know you don't have a yew. Some juniper also have blueberries. They don't have an opening in the end the way that you do. They look a lot like blueberries, actually. They're just completely round. And then the last look-alike I'll show you is called arborvitae. This is another tree that has scale-like leaves. You can see this overlapping scales here on the sample in the upper right. And they can be kind of small. There's all different shapes, pretty small. This one's less than 3 feet tall, or they can be quite large. They're often pruned the same way you are, into a hedge. If you want more information on yew and some of the lookalikes and some of the things that can be planted in place of them, you can go to our website at Fish and Game, idfg.idaho.gov/conservation/yew. And you can read more about all aspects of growing yew in Idaho there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kay. I think I have to stop sharing my screen. There we go. I'm going to turn it over to Kay Draper from the Blaine County Noxious Weed Department.
Thanks, Lynn, and good evening to everybody. Really nice presentation, Lynn. Thank you for all the information. As soon as we were made aware of the wildlife deaths, we started reaching out to our landowners here in the valley. and where the deaths had occurred, and hopefully our hope was to identify possible U plants. We conducted several site visits throughout the county, and we actually found a handful of U's and had them removed. Our local landscape companies help us remove those plants, which was a great help. Now that the snow is melting, it is easier to see the U's, and we want to continue these efforts. If you think you know of a location of a U plant, we'd really like for you to call the Blaine County Noxious Weed Department, and my phone number is 208-727-7221. I believe Stephanie's going to put that in the chat for you. Or you can also do it on our website at blainecounty.org on the noxious weed page. That information comes to us. It is kept confidential, so the information you give us and the location of the U plants will be all kept confidential. It's under the report a weed on the noxious weed page at blainecounty.org again. And I believe Stephanie's going to put that in the chat as well for you. Other than that, I really would like to open this session up to questions that you might have, and we're here to answer those for you. And we want to thank everybody that has attended and everybody in the Valley that has been such a great help. And it's been a nice collaborative effort amongst all. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Kay. Thanks, everyone. First off, I also would like to thank the Fish and Game Conservation officers, Officer Orchard with Sun Valley Police Department, and John Gilmore. He's the property manager for the Valley Club. All of these parties have been really, really helpful with this process. Most of them have been the ones responding to the calls about the poisoned animals, which I personally would not want to respond to. And they also all participated in a really helpful workshop that Lynn and Terry put together for us, where we were able to learn a little bit more about how to identify the U plant. We actually took a field trip throughout the county together to identify plants in areas where animals had been found earlier in the winter. That effort was very, very productive, very, very helpful for the county at least. And I'm very grateful for everyone for participating in that, for Lynn and Terry for putting that together for us. So thank you for that. Definitely helped us be able to come into this with all the skills that we need. And also, before we head into the question and answer session, I did want to let everyone know about a wonderful brochure that Fish and Game put together for us. This brochure is really, really helpful. It has some information about how to identify the U plant, the toxicity of the U plant, and then it also has some question and answer sections on the back. It also speaks a little bit on the ordinance in Blaine County. So as Terry mentioned earlier this evening, Blaine County back in 2016, in response to all of the animal deaths, our Board of Commissioners did put together the ordinance number 2016-01. And that ordinance does ban the planting, the sale, and the owning of a U plant in Blaine County. Now, one thing that is important for everyone to know is that this plant is not on the state noxious weed list. So this ordinance only applies to unincorporated Blaine County. The city of Haley and the city of Ketchum followed suit, and they also have their own ordinances. So we do have that in place, but there are other areas in the county, other cities that do not have the ordinance. That does make enforcement a little bit different on our end, but that's something that we're working on, and the cities have been really, really helpful at helping us with this and working with us and helping us with the education. So we are really, really thankful for the communities here and for everyone taking this issue very seriously. So from there, we will go ahead and move into the question and answer session. So we already have one question. With the history of the knowledge of toxicity of the U, has there been any attempt at legislation to ban the sale of ornamental U's statewide? I don't know if Kay or Lynn would like to answer this.
I can start first, and Lynn, if you'd like to join in. And back in 2016, this was taken to state legislation and the Department of Ag in hopes that we would be able to put this on the state noxious weed list. At that time, they didn't feel like it was necessary. It's still not on the state noxious weed list, but that's when it came back to us and it became an ordinance here in Blaine County. So I do believe state legislation has been made aware, has been involved, but the decisions were made in 2016, and I don't know of any progress since then as far as going back to legislation with it.
Great, thank you, Kay. Kaz, it looked like you unmuted for a second. Did you have a question?
Hey, thanks so much for your presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So what work has been done with the landscaping companies that sell plants to this valley? Thank you. And that was a really great presentation. I'm so glad we did all that identification and comparison of other similar looking plants. It's super helpful. And I'm so glad that you guys were able to find some plants that's, you know, here. So that's pretty productive and successful. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Kaz. I guess I'll speak a little bit on the landscape companies. Kay, feel free to jump in if I miss anything. So Kay initially, when this issue came to light earlier this winter, she reached out to all the landscaping companies and reminded them of the ordinance, reminded them of the toxicity of the U, and let them know what can be done if there is U, and that people can reach out to Blaine County as a resource to help identify. And then I, as the education specialist for Blaine County, have also reached out to landscaping companies, and I will be meeting with all of them to conduct kind of like a short identification training just based off of what Lynn has taught me, and then provide them with materials that they can give to their employees and have posted around, because you know, sometimes there's some turnaround in some of these businesses where people might come in and not be aware. And so this can give them some information that can help them understand how to identify it, how serious it is, and that it does need to be removed. And we have also learned that we do need to make sure that everyone understands how to remove the U plant. You do have to remove all of the plants. And if you remove it and some of the little needles spread out throughout the yard, animals can still come over, eat those needles, and be poisoned. So it really does need to be thoroughly cleaned up, which is another thing we want to work with the landscaping companies on. So this is an effort that is still ongoing, but I will be meeting with them and I will be working with them still moving forward. Kay, did you have anything you needed to add to that?
The only thing I would add, Stephanie, is that we even reached out to landscaping companies in Jerome and the Twin Falls area to make them aware too that this is prohibited in our valley in Blaine County. We got wonderful responses from everybody, and it was a good conversation amongst the landscape companies and myself.
Thank you. And it looks like we have another question in the chat. Have any efforts been made to connect with businesses that are on properties often, such as real estate, construction companies, property management companies, to have them keep an eye out? I can answer part of that. We have reached out to property management companies. That's another effort that Kay made, so she can speak on that more. And some of them have actually, for example, with the Valley Club, they've been very, very helpful, very hands-on, sending information to all of their tenants, bringing us on property to help identify, and have really been involved in this process. Kay, I can let you speak on that a little bit more of the work that you did early on.
I think you actually covered it pretty well, Stephanie. We got a great response, and we reached out to several property managements. Actually, a blast email went out to most of all of the associations that are here in our area. I think there was close to 80 that blast email went out to. So it was property management, it was landscaping companies, it was realtors, it was private landowners that own large sections of land. So I think we did a superb effort when this all started to reach out to the necessary parties. And once again, we had an amazing response.
And we have, especially now that we have the brochure as well, we'll be able to pass that around and get the word out in some more ways, like bring that to some of those real estate companies and such as well. And we are hoping to put together kind of a volunteer group to help us distribute this brochure. So we have some more education that we have to do, definitely. Some other questions that we have. One is, why aren't the poisonous plants labeled as such? Lynn, do you want to take over that one?
Sure. I don't know why they aren't labeled when they're sold, but certainly if they are sold to somebody and they plant them at their yard and then move away, you know, it's almost like we all kind of have to be aware and keep educating whether they're, even if they were initially labeled. But one thing to keep in mind is that there are several other landscape plants that are poisonous, including rhododendron, monkshood, myrtle spurge, lupin, some others, and even some house plants that are poisonous, and some garden plants, garden vegetables like the leaves of tomatoes or rhubarb are poisonous. So even though some poisonous plants are fairly common in our landscapes, none have caused the numbers of wildlife deaths that we've seen with you. In fact, they haven't even come close. I've never heard of anybody dying from eating tomato leaves. So it's a good question.
And then we've definitely gotten this question quite a bit. Do the local nurseries sell the U plants? Kay, do you want to speak on that?
No, they do not, but the outlying landscape companies and nurseries do.
Yep. And we have also reached out to those, or Kay has reached out to those companies in the other cities around our area to inform them of this as well. So another question that we've received, where can you safely be disposed of, and how much does it cost? So the great thing is that Ohio Gulch Transfer Station accepts the U plant for free. So as long as you don't have that plant in a load with other plants or with other trash or different things, you're able to bring it in there for free and dump it. They do ask that you have it bagged, and we would suggest that as well. That way the needles and all that aren't going to fall off around the dump or even on your drive to the dump. And they do dump it in the garbage, so it doesn't go with the other wood waste that you have where it can be reprocessed or turned into sod or whatnot. They don't do that because the U plant can still be toxic. So they do just completely dispose of it in a very safe way for our community. So that is a really great resource for everyone. So if you do have U on your plant, I'd highly suggest using Ohio Gulch and taking advantage of that. So when people remove the plants, we've talked about that a little bit. Do they have to remove the roots of the plant? Can they just cut the branches off? What should they do? Lynn, do you mind answering that?
Oh yeah, sure. The U will resprout from the roots. So if you just cut it off at the trunk or at ground level, more sprouts probably will come up. And so you need to either treat it with herbicide to kill that root, or you need to dig it out, at least the main part. You don't have to get all the tiny little roots out at the ends, but at least that main root and some of the bigger feeder roots going into that. I've read that in one study where they looked at root mass that had been in the ground for 7 years, and it was still pretty much as toxic as a fresh root. So it's important to keep in mind that any part of this plant can kill somebody or kill an animal even years later if it's not covered, buried in a landfill. If new sprouts do come up, so say it's the winter and somebody cuts the trunk off and they're going to dig the trunk out or the roots out in the spring, if new sprouts come up, those should be cut off right away and considered extremely toxic. And also be aware if you're pulling the root out, that wood of U can be very dense and hard, and the roots can actually dig into the foundation of a house or get into cracks in the foundation. And so if somebody decides to hook it up to a pickup with a chain and then go try to pull it out, they can actually pull a hole in their foundation, or it's so hard the chain can just break and snap. And so it's better to dig it out. I wouldn't recommend the pickup truck and chain method. Better to dig it out and then use something, an axe or a saw, to cut off those main feeder roots.
Stephanie,
Terry.
just add one thing really quick, kind of an anecdote or actual situation that we had down here in Jerome County a couple years ago, where a homeowner had ewe on their property. They trimmed it up, and they also had horses. They then took the branches, threw them over in the pasture, thinking that it was just, leave it over there, compost naturally on its own. They actually killed their horse. So, this is definitely unintentional, but it's just one of those lessons learned. Unfortunately, it had a bad ending that, it's probably not considered untypical for somebody to throw something over into a pasture and let their horses nibble on it. But just a word of caution that I think it's been pointed out that even dried needles can be toxic. But and then one last thing I wanted to add too was the brochure that Stephanie showed was not just a fish and game brochure. Stephanie and Kay were instrumental in helping get that done. So definitely thanks to the two of them for helping get that brochure written.
And Stephanie, if I may add, thanks, Terry. I appreciate that. I have actually done some follow-up on the ewe plants that we have found previously about a month ago or so. And what I'm finding very common is that there are still several branches and small pieces laying all over the ground, possibly stuck in landscapers' rakes and then transported to other areas of the garden. So once again, I'd like to remind everyone that it's super important to get all those pieces up. They are very toxic.
I guess I forgot to mention, but only a cup of needles is enough to kill a small elk. And a cup can basically fit in your hand. So it doesn't take very much. And a dog chewing on a stick, if your dog likes to play fetch with a stick and somebody throws a ewe stick and that dog chews on it a little bit, they can actually die from that. There are records in the veterinary literature. So I'm glad you pointed that out, Kay.
Yeah, it's a very, very toxic plant. So since this has been an issue since 2016 and before that, a lot of people ask why this is still a problem in the Wood River Valley.
Do you want me to take that one? Okay. A lot of it, I think, just comes back to education. Everybody knows Wood River Valley has a bit of a transitory population. People come and go. I know I used to live in the Wood River Valley years ago, and so it's just one of these things that needs to be reminded. And I think this is what a commitment that this group has made, the county, Fish and Game, and others, is that we need to keep this in front of residents all the time, so that everybody knows that, one, it's illegal to bring you into Blaine County, but also the impacts that it can have on wildlife, pets, and people. So I think you always hear the term "it takes a village." I think this is a classic example of it's going to take a village, because it's going to be up to each person that lives in the Wood River Valley, cities, county, private businesses. Everybody's going to have to become basically ewe aware, if that sounds right, so that we don't have ewe being brought into the valley and planted. And I don't think it's ever done intentionally from a standpoint of thumbing their nose at the ordinance or at the toxicity of the plant. It's just people, you see it all over the place, because it's a great plant if you want that evergreen look year round. In the summertime, those red, the aerials that Lynn talked about, the berry makes it a very attractive plant to have in your yard. So I don't think anybody has maliciously or intentionally done it. But I think it's going to, like I say, it's going to take everybody to keep this in front of everybody throughout the valley, so that we can actually start doing like we did a month ago, where we start driving around town and we don't go, oh, there's one right there, right along the road. So it's interesting, once you learn how to identify them, all of a sudden they kind of jump out at you. So anyway, I think education is the key here in this effort.
Definitely. And also, why does it seem like animals only eat you in the winter? We only have an issue with it in the winter, Terry.
That's a great question. So I think to start to understand that, let's just take a step back and look at the animal themselves. So elk are grazers, meaning they spring, summer, fall, they're eating grasses. That is their primary food source. Deer, moose are browsers. So that's kind of where they're looking for their typical food source. In the wintertime, well, let me take a step back. In the summertime, the reason why we may not be seeing animals dying from yew is it could be that there's just so much variety of vegetation on the landscape that the chance encounter with a yew would be less. Most of the wildlife, at least we hope, they migrate out of the valley and go back up into what we would term summer range, higher elevation. Now, could deer, elk, moose be eating yew in the summertime? Absolutely. Do they die if they eat the yew? Absolutely. But you know, we don't know of every animal that dies on the landscape. In the winter, they're just more concentrated in urban areas. So then in the wintertime, the elk that normally graze, now all of a sudden there's snow, they're looking for something to eat. Yew being green, and I asked one of our biologists the other day if elk can see in color, and he goes, I don't know. So, but because I was wondering, you know, what is it, the green plant that is attracting the elk? But if they're hungry and there's not a lot of vegetation available to them, they'll go to what presents itself. And many times, as you saw in those pictures, those yew sprigs would be protruding out of the snow. So I think a lot of it just happens to be what they would typically eat and where they would typically find it. One of the things that we talked about in the office not too long ago was animals can have kind of a learned behavior, if you will. So if they learn that eating a certain plant makes them feel sick or just doesn't taste good, that learned behavior will kind of be passed, if you will, along, and they just tend to avoid these plants. Yew, on the other hand, it is so toxic that there's no opportunity, and I don't mean to laugh when I say that, but there's no opportunity to develop a learned behavior, because if an animal was to eat the yew, it's not going to learn that that's not a good one to eat, because it'll kill them. So not making light of that in any sense at all, but it is an interesting question when you start looking at why we see it in the wintertime. But I think it basically comes down to food availability and the amount of food on the landscape that these animals would have.
Great. Does anyone else online have any questions? You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask that if you have any. All right. Well, if anyone is interested in learning more about the yew plant, there we go. If anyone's interested in learning more about the yew plant, Lynn Kinter is going to be up in the Valley on April 21st at 5:30 p.m. at the Healy Library for a program called All About You. So I'd encourage everyone to go attend that event and learn more about the U plants. Also, if anyone has any questions about the U plant or what Blaine County is doing, or want us to go inspect a property, you can reach out to Kay. If you have any questions about the education efforts or you want to get more involved in that, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'm going to put both of our emails in the chat right now, so you can hurry and copy those. Otherwise, thank you, Kay, Terry, and Lynn so much for participating in this. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you all found this information helpful, and I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Bye.